Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I guess we were talking mainly about your book Story Machines, which I have here. As you can see, lots of notes. Um, and that you wrote together with Mike Sharples. I thought maybe to kind of start talking about that and get the ball rolling, I thought maybe I'd ask kind of how you got into this, and maybe we can start with like what is the School of Cognitive and Computing Sciences at the University of Sussex, and how did you end up there? I mean, you're from Mexico originally, so how did you end up in Sussex to do a master's?
Yes, well, in Mexico, I studied electronics and computers. And when I finished my undergraduate studies, I wanted to go to study a postgraduate course to some place. And I found Sussex, and I really like it because they work with multidisciplinary teams. And for me, that was a key aspect. I think it's extremely important to work in an interdisciplinary environment. So I thought it was a good option. So I went there to study my master in knowledge based systems. One day, we got an email from one of the young professors there asking if someone wanted to write his dissertation for the master's about computers and creativity. And I was like, wow, what? Computers and creativity? What is this? For me, creativity all my life has been very, very important. Creativity is an important word that I have heard my entire life. So of course I answered that mail. I ended doing my dissertation about using a neural network to evaluate some basic music. So I fell in love with that. I really, really like it. So I went to talk to that professor and told him that I would like to study a PhD because about computers and creativity. So we were discussing, he agreed, and that professor was Mike Sharpless. We started to work together and we got along very, very well. We had a very good relationship. So after I finished my PhD, we're still in contact. And we decided around 2001 that we want to write a book together about narrative characters. So the book was to be called Creativity in Computers, Computer-Based Storytellers. That was the title. We thought it was going to be around 150 pages, and we thought we were going to be able to finish it on May 31st, 2002. So
Okay.
different things happened, and we were not able to do this thing. We had to wait 20 years to achieve this one. 20 years. But 3 years later, we wrote together a paper where we compare three computer models: MEXICA, my story generator, Brutus, and Minstrel. And that paper was important because somehow give us a good idea how the book could be, how we could develop this further into a book. But well, time passed and we have to wait until 2017. Mike was in Mexico City in those days. He was here at my place and we were talking, and we start again to talk about the importance of writing this book. So we agreed that when we finish, as soon as we finish our current business, our commitments, we will start to seriously talk again about doing this book. So in September 2019, we were in London. I was at Mike's house. And finally, we start to seriously talk about this project. The project, the idea of the project was to write a book that allow people who were not experts to understand better how all these new technologies, particular narrative generators, work. Because I think it's very, very important for our society to be informed about these developments because they are having a really, really strong effect in society. And there are a lot of misinformation around, a lot. So we thought it was very important. So we agreed to write two books. One, Story Machines, is the one who is more general. It describes past, present, and future of narrative generators and gives a global view of the field. And the second book, who is going to be published in a few months in July by Oxford University Press, it describes in much more detail how each of these systems, or some of the most important systems for narrative generation works. The second book also is intended for people who not are experts in computer science, but of course they need to have some knowledge. Yes, I mean, it's not, you have to have some background, but you don't have to be an expert in computer science. So that's that's the discussion we had that day in London in 2019. So we agree in working in this project, these two books, and we start to work in the project, and what finally we have finished both of them, and we are very, very happy. And the first to be published was Story Machines.
Yeah. So maybe to make it more specific, I mean, the book is very much about, at least that's the way I look at it, it's very much about this kind of, it seems to me there's a goal to try and create machines, or like, you know, computer programs, AI, whatever you want to call it, that can write stories, you know, maybe even entire novels that people enjoy reading and that kind of stuff. And it's, and as I said, you described kind of like how it started, the early days, and what's happening today. And yeah, it's funny that we're talking right now. I guess it's a bit of a coincidence, but I mean, in the last few weeks, it seems like ChatGPT has really become quite famous in the news and in all the kind of this kind of things, because it can, you know, produce very, well, text that seems quite human in that sense. And to go back, so it seems like to me, by the way, one question, you call it MEXICA?
MEXICA, yeah, MEXICA.
But it's a sh sound, not a Mexic or something like that.
No, it's MEXICA, exactly. S-H.
And the country, you say the same way, or
no?
Mexico. Or...
In Spanish, we say Mexico. Mexico. But that sound doesn't exist in Spanish. So that's the reason the Spanish, when they arrive to Mexico, they use this X, to represent that sound, because it's not a sound we use in Spanish. So that's the reason with X.
Okay. So it seems to me that project then started very early on, that since you started working on creativity and computers. Yeah, maybe to provide a bit of the history of kind of these things, like when you started working on MEXICA, if I got that right.
That's right, very good.
Kind of what were you trying to do with it that hadn't already been done? Kind of what was the new aspect that you were trying to add to existing programs?
When I started my PhD, there were some interesting programs around.
So this was like 2000. When was this? 2000, 1990? When was this roughly?
First, I studied my master from 92 to 93, and I started the PhD in 1993.
Okay.
So there were some programs around, two that I really, really like. One is called Minstrel. Program writes short stories about the King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And the other that I really like is called Daydreamer. It simulates a woman who is having daydreamings about she's in love with Harrison Ford, so she starts to imagine the things that she could do with Harrison Ford. So all those are the narratives. And those programs, all those and others, were based in a technique that is called problem solving, that basically the idea is that you have initial goal, you have a final goal, you have a set of operators or actions that your characters can perform in order to move from the initial state to the goal state, to the final state. That's the essence. And they did very, very interesting things with that. But that technique didn't... I felt that it was necessary to explore other options. Because when we write, it's true that sometimes we have goals, clear goals that we want to achieve that. But some other times, that's not the case. Some other times, ideas just came. Yes, and we just start to write. I read a lot about how writers write, what they say about writing, what writers say about writing. And some of them describe these ideas that For example, they don't know what is going to happen, no? That the story just develops. And that kind of stuff is not represented in problem solving because, as I mentioned, you have a final goal. You have clearly the goals you want to achieve. So what I wanted was to develop a system that was not based exclusively in problem solving. I wanted to generate something different that represent that process where we just start to generate ideas without a specific goal. All this was shaped by my conversation with Mike Sharpless because he, in those days, was finishing of developing this cognitive model of creative writing. And his ideas feel very well with this concern I had because he says that writing is a process that has two states. One is called engagement, the other is called reflection. The typical example of engagement is when we are daydreaming, ideas just flow. We don't have control of how these ideas arrive. And the other state, reflection, is a very analytic, very much problem-solving oriented process. Yes. So the combination of both is what produces the creative process in humans. Of course, these ideas are very old, no? They have a long history, but Mike was able to collect all of them and put them together and incorporate new elements to all these ideas and make something really coherent. So inspired by all these ideas, I use it as a framework to build MEXICA, especially because this engagement state was like something for me like, yes, no, we need to represent something different. No, that sounded to me more like the way we humans work, not more like that mechanical problem solving approach. So that was my goal, to try to produce something different. So I started to think a lot about that, not because this framework, the engagement, reflection, cognitive account of creative writing is very interesting, but it's very general. No, it's a very good framework, but there are a lot of gaps there that you need to fulfill in order to build a computer program. No? So there are many things I can describe about that, but we will need like several weeks to go into too many details. So I will just say that one of the things I did is to think how we can represent this engagement process, this automatic process where the system just starts to associate ideas without using goal, how we can do that. And my solution was to represent the emotional relations and conflicts between characters as a way to associate ideas. And for me, that's one of the main contributions of the system. So in that way, I was able to generate sequence of more or less coherent ideas, and then reflection goes into the stage to fix all the gaps there, no? All the gaps that happen during the generation process, and then we have a coherent story. And that was something important because before, all programs at the end use some kind of predefined structure to be sure that the output was going to be coherent. And MEXICA didn't use that. No, MEXICA, the story just emerged as part of all this process I'm describing. And I think that was something very important, so something very different to what happened before. So that was like the main motivation, not to do about doing something different to what was in that moment, because problem solving has had a really, really huge influence in the development of automatic storytelling. And I think I achieved the goal. So I was very happy with the results. And of course, during all this year, I have been working in improving the system because it's endless. No, this is an endless process. We know so few about how the creative process works that always there are a lot of opportunities and ideas there. No, but that's how it started.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that, I mean, so you mentioned that the early versions often had a very problem-solving kind of approach to writing fiction or short stories usually. And in the book, you also mention lots that take I can't remember which is which anymore, but they take like lots of folk stories or different kinds of stories, and then kind of try and get the essence out of them, and then try and retell a story in that style. Am I correct then in understanding that Mexica then tries to? It's. I mean, one thing that sets it apart is that potentially the stories are more creative than if you just kind of retell stories that you put into the system. Or do you still kind of start with that large base of like you feed lots of stories into the system, and then from there it learns to retell stories?
Well, let me first answer this last part. The idea of Mexica is to represent some of the ways we work in order to generate a story. That means that Mexica needs some knowledge. I mean, we are able to generate stories because we have experience, we have lived, we have knowledge. Yes. So Mexica is not part of the Mexica model to represent how we get that knowledge. So I assume that Mexica already has that knowledge. So to do that, I provide some information to the system. And the main idea of that information is that Mexica is able to register how we people act under specific contexts that are described in terms of the emotional links and conflicts between characters. For example, from the stories I provide to Mexica, Mexica register that when someone is in love, what is something logical to do, for example. Yes. Because that, by the way, is very social. No, it depends a lot. It's not the same how people behave when are in love in the UK, in Germany, or in Mexico. No, it's very, very different. No, when my father was young, he and his mates used to go to serenade girls around the city, with the guitars and play, these romantic songs, something like that. No? I have never seen something like that. I don't know if it happened, but at least I have never seen that something like that in the UK, for example, where I lived 5 years. So this is very social, which is very interesting. So I provide the stories not to provide words. I don't work with words, but to provide information that the system can then recollect and use it to know, between quotation, how to continue given a specific context in terms of this emotional conflict. That's the kind of information I provide. And as I explained before, because Mexica, it's assumed that Mexica already has that knowledge. It's not just newborn. Yes. So yes, I use that information to generate. Is that more creative than other techniques? Oof, no, it's a complicated question because we don't have really a universal definition of creativity. I mean, the best we have is that creativity is something that is new and is novel or interesting. No? Something new, something novel, and something interesting or useful. That's more or less the general definition, but even that has some problems. No, what is novel is not that simple. So I wouldn't at all say that one system is more creative than the other, but definitely these different approaches, the approach that Mexica follows, the approach that problem solving follows, the programs based on problem solving follows, and the new techniques based on deep neural networks, they contribute in completely different ways. They provide different information, different perspectives. And at the end, all that are important because, as I said, we don't understand creativity, we don't understand how we work. So we need as much information as possible to start to figure out things.
So, yeah, I mean, for example, you sent me 2 stories, although I think there's also one story is in Story Machines. You reproduced it. I mean, it would be too long to read the entire story here now, but I thought so what's interesting to me is about these stories that Mexica produces is that it's very much, it reads a little bit like almost a synopsis of like an action point list almost, right? I mean, for example, this one story I have in front of me, which is story 18, for example. I mean, just to read like a little bit of it. Unexpectedly, the lady saw the princess had the sacred knife that was stolen from the temple, so there was no doubt she was the murderer of the old priest. The princess produced in the lady conflicting feelings. This kind of like description of what the feelings are is, of course, very different from what you might read in a novel. And so I'm curious, like, how would you, to make that an engaging story, you wouldn't usually just describe the emotion in this like very direct way, but you might try and get at it more indirectly. So I'm curious, like, what's missing from the, like, how can you add that basically to the program to take it kind of to the next level in that sense?
Let me explain something. Two things. One is that Mexica, what really is a plot generator. Is what it is. It's not a language model. So the goal of Mexica is not to produce nice language, stories with not nice language, but to produce sequence of coherent, interesting, and novel ideas, a sequence of action. That's the main goal of Mexica. And that's because Mexica is a research tool to try to understand better how we work, to be able to produce that sequence of interesting, novel, and coherent ideas. That's what I'm really interested in. So in this case, one thing that I really like is that Mexica has some knowledge about the emotional status of the characters. And that's the reason I thought it was interesting that in some specific points, the system make a reference to that emotional status of the characters. And that's the reason that phrase that you read is there, no? In that moment. Now, it would be better to describe it in another way, yes. And it's very simple in Mexica because Mexica use templates to generate the final output because, as I just mentioned, it's not a language model. So it uses these basic templates, and then you can put elaborate ways to describe things. Yes, in very, very different ways. For me, the important thing is that Mexica is able to recognize this emotional situation and do something about that, either include it in the story or deciding not to include it, wherever. But that for me is like the core of my goals. No, it's like how this happened, how we humans realize about that, how we can using this information make something to happen in the story. That's the kind of things Mexica is trying to represent. That's the reason this phrase is like that. It's simple because if I use very elaborated phrases, somehow I don't want people to think that that was produced by Mexica because as Mexica is not its goal. No? So, but it's simple to do it. It's not a big problem. Not to put more something more. No, the princess, the heart of the princess was beating fast because she knew something was wrong here. For example, I don't know. I'm just saying a word, a phrase.
Okay, but that's interesting, yeah, because I slightly misunderstood the point of Mexica because I thought it was an attempt to write stories rather than it. I mean, it sounds to me almost as if you're trying to understand the human mind by modeling part of the creative process.
That's the goal. Exactly, that's the goal. No, trying to contribute to the understanding of how our mind works when we produce short stories. That's the idea. So we have these ideas, the engagement reflection, plus all the other things like the emotional relation between characters. So that's the kind of knowledge we need to make sense of the world. Make sense of the world. So, for example, based on Mexica, I'm claiming that this use of emotions to represent relationships are essential to be able to make sense of the world. So that's the kind of stuff I'm trying to do. That's the goal of Mexica.
Okay, that really changes my. Yeah, it's funny. Like when you think something has this particular purpose, but it actually has a very different purpose.
And that's important. I'm happy we're talking about that because one of the themes I'm a little bit concerned with all these cover in the media about programs like Chat GPT and before GPT-3 and all that, that people start to think that that's the only kind of models that exist for narrative generation, and their goals are the only goals that people follow when they are working in narrative generation. And that's a terrible mistake, in my opinion. And I think it's very important that society is aware about that. So in the Story Machines, in the book, we explain different ways that have different goals to produce narratives. Of course, we include GPT-3, we include an explanation, but we also describe the engagement reflection model and MEXICA, and we also describe the problem-solving programs like the one I was mentioning earlier, like Minstrel and Daydreamer, and also we describe other techniques like story grammars, not based in the work of Vladimir Prop, about the Russian folk stories. So it's important that people understand that. No, there are different goals, different perspectives, different ways to generate that. Not only the one who have a lot of money to make a lot of publicity about their own systems. No? We are other also there who have been working for many, many years doing this kind of stuff. No?
That was really not necessarily the most interesting aspect, but the one that surprised me most, let's put it that way, about the book was that I studied psychology and neuroscience, let's say, in the last 10 years. And through neuroscience, I also did my master's at UCL, where, Demis Hassabis with DeepMind and a lot of the people from DeepMind came from and still have lots of connections to that. So that's kind of what I always... you could almost say like what I grew up with as the idea of what artificial intelligence is. And of course, they've done lots of great things and made lots of advances. But so when I thought about, machines that write stories and these kind of things, I thought that was like, yeah, as you said, like the only way that you can do that. And when I opened your book, I was like, oh, there's all these other approaches that have been going back for decades, or sometimes centuries, right? These like old mechanical machines that people use to create Latin poetry or whatever. Yeah, it was really interesting to me to see like, oh yeah, this is I guess, as you alluded to, most of the people have been missing out on kind of the other half, and potentially also an equally important half, because that's especially where the structure for the story comes from. That maybe is, well, I don't know actually whether like GPT-3 and ChatGPT have really been used to actually create stories and novels. I don't actually know, but the kind of more structural aspects that these other systems use are actually, just as important. But yeah, as you said, they're not really discussed much.
Exactly. Yes, I'm very happy to hear what you are telling me, because that's exactly the goal of the book. People need to understand that the field is much, much bigger than just machine learning. There are a lot of other things there. All these approaches have limitations and have strong aspects, all of them, including deep neural networks, all of them. So it depends what your goals are. If your goal is to try to understand the mind, or to try to contribute to the understanding of the mind, like is the MEXICA case, then systems like GPT-3 are very bad for that. People don't know really what is going on inside the system. So if your goal is to generate very impressive text with a lot of different topics, of course, GPT-3 is really good at that. No, it generates something very, very impressive things. No, but so it shows the power of pattern recognition and statistic information models to produce this kind of text. No? So it's important to know all this, because we as society need to be aware of all the good things about these technologies, but also about the risk that they can present, and to have the proper information about how they work will help us as a society to be able to push for the good things, no, and to alert from, hey, be careful with this, be careful with that, no. So that's the reason I believe it's so important that society understand better this kind of system, and don't believe that only there is one company or two companies that develop artificial intelligence, and all of their systems are the only ways, because the way many journalists report this is in that way. It seems that only two, three companies are doing artificial intelligence, and that's not true, at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Like, I guess most of the questions I prepared were around trying to create machines that can write stories. But now that you've kind of, at least to me, clarified like the purpose of MEXICA, it almost seems like that's going in a direction that, well, I mean, I guess the book is still, like, Story Machines is still very much about like trying to, in a way, like it's a survey of the different approaches people have taken to write machines that can write stories. Yeah, I'm just curious, like, is there, it seems to me then that there's a little bit these two different, like conceptually different approaches to creating those machines. The one is, the more conceptual, structural, the ones like yours and the previous ones, and then the current more famous ones are the ones that are built on lots of data with language and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I'm assuming there must be like people trying to combine the two to kind of get the best of both worlds, right? Or
yes, traditionally the first type, like MEXICA or like Minstrel, this other system based on problem solving, are symbolic systems. That they are classified as symbolic systems, and we have these connectionist models. These all those based on deep neural networks and this kind of stuff. When the results of using neural networks started to appear, there was this huge boom. All these articles have been published in the last years, in the last months, for some years now, showing and talking and describing what is going to happen. But also, slowly, all the limitations of this system are also starting to emerge. Because, as I mentioned before, all of those systems have strong points and weak points. That's the nature of science and the development of this kind of programs. And something that is starting to slowly take more force is this idea of combining both, the symbolic systems with the neural system. They are calling it neuro-symbolic systems. This idea has been for a long time. It's not something really new, but now they are trying to do it also in narrative generation. We will see where it goes. I think really what we need is something different, not the combination of both, but the fusion of both to generate something new. That's where I think is the direction we need to go. Of course, I don't have the answer, how to implement it, but because clearly we need to cover the gaps that the different system has, but there's still a lot of things we need to sort it out. So that's the reason I think we need something new. But yes, certainly the next step is how to combine them, how to see how we can work with these different approaches together and start to get better results in different aspects. So definitely this is the route.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I was thinking about when I started preparing for this conversation is like, basically, why might something like GPT-3 and that kind of approach, why might that not work so well for stories? And the answer I got, basically, I'm curious what you think about my answer, whether that makes sense or it's kind of a stupid answer. But the basic answer I thought why it might not work is because the main problem is data, so that they don't have enough data. So this is based on the following idea. So from what I understand, the reason that, let's say, a company like DeepMind, was super successful with the games is because a computer can play billions of games, against each other, against itself, and can get feedback, every few seconds that it can use for the reinforcement learning or whatever agent they use. Now, that's very difficult to do if you're trying to write, let's take the extreme case, you're trying to write a novel. To get feedback about how good the novel is, i.e. how good the AI is performing in writing a novel, a human has to read the novel and then tell you like how much they like it or what aspects they like of it or whatever, which means instead of a supercomputer or a cluster being able to, run billions of games in a few days or whatever. Now you need people to assess basically the quality and to provide the feedback manually. Therefore, you just can't run a system that requires that much data. Does that kind of make sense? I mean, especially like at the big structural level of a story, right? Because you need to read the entire book to say whether you like the book or not.
Yes, I think you are in the right direction. To play a game is very different to write a story, not very different activities. No, games have very specific rules, very clear rules that you can represent and you follow. To write a story requires a lot of different things, not just data. It requires understanding of different situations, social situations, cultural situations, requires also to understand how we humans behave, emotions I mentioned before. No, for me, stories are emotions. No, these are in very essential part, and nothing of that is represented in programs like GPT. No, in programs using transformers, those systems. First, they don't know even that they are writing. They cannot reflect about what they are writing. They don't have knowledge or representation of the world. What they do is they use this very, very sophisticated statistical information to generate the next phrase. No, transformers now allow to take a whole context of linguistic elements to decide how to continue the narrative. As I said, storytelling is much, much more than that. So that's the reason is I think we are far away from achieving really real results about storytelling. Systems like MEXICA or others like Minstrel try to represent this kind of aspects. For example, Minstrel, the program Minstrel, has a model of how creativity works. I'm not going to describe here to avoid technical details, but it has a specific representation with details about how the author, Turner, thinks the creativity works. And it includes some representation of the mind, some representation of characters. In the case of MEXICA, I explained already to you that MEXICA represents this relation between characters. The new version of MEXICA is able to evaluate its own output. Of course, this evaluation doesn't compare to human evaluation. We are still far away from that because I mentioned this before. I will repeat it several times. We don't understand how our brain works. We don't understand how our mind works. The evaluation process is something very complex. It's not that simple as sometimes we seem to believe. But at least there is a model there, how to evaluate the stories it produces. So MEXICA puts a grade between 1 and 100 about the stories it generates. So sometimes it's very happy with its own story. Sometimes it says, oh, this is rubbish. Not, I put 5 or 4 or 3. That happened because it has a completely different, let's say, philosophy of how to represent this process. No, it's not just a lot of data that you extract the patterns and that makes these statistical associations. So I believe that you are right. We cannot go further so far because we need other information that is not possible to obtain from huge amounts of data like the one I have just described. No? It's not possible to obtain from relationships between this huge amount of data. For example, understanding of how the world works, understanding how our emotion works, understanding that in Mexico, if you are in love, at least before you used to serenade a girl, and things like that. No, I wrote a song to make my wife fell in love with me, for example. No? I mean,
it seems to work for your family.
People make different. Yeah, it works. Yeah. Because my wife is from Barcelona, so I have to kidnap her. I have to convince her to come here. So I did a lot of things between those. One of those was to compose a song for her. So to serenade. Once I serenade her from Mexico, I was with a group of friends. They played the guitar. I played the guitar. So I told them, guys, we are going to serenade a girl tonight. Oh, perfect. In which neighborhood she lives? They ask. I said, she lives in Barcelona. What? Yes, in Barcelona. So we telephone, and we spent like 30 minutes in a house friend singing for her. And of course, she was crying because she had never received before a serenade, because it's social, it's something different. Yeah. So this kind of stuff cannot be represented or cannot be just modeled in a computer system based just in huge amounts of data, of linguistic or yes, data with linguistic elements, no words, paragraphs, and so on. So I think you are right. That's the reason it makes sense to start to combine these approaches. No, the reason I believe we need something new is because, okay, we are going to combine them. So if we are successful, maybe we will have some representation of the world with this huge capacity to produce language, that language models have. But still, there are too many gaps there that we need to connect. There are many things, aspects that we need to connect. I don't see how, for example, thinking of MEXICA, I don't see how my representation of emotional relationships and conflicts can be useful in a system based on deep neural networks. We need to see how we are going to make these connections.
It's funny. I just try to imagine what would happen in Germany if you came up with a bunch of guys and you all started playing the guitar in front of someone's house. I know they'd probably just like, not sure they'd call the police, but the neighbors would be very annoyed with the whole situation, that it would be disturbing the peace and quiet of the neighborhood or something. But I mean, what's funny about it is that I can definitely see how, let's say you train a system on all sorts of stories. I can definitely see how the system learns. Let's say you put lots of Mexican stories into it. It learns like, this is an important part of love, if you don't specify that it's in Mexico. And then it will add that to any story that might be in a different place, just that it would seem completely out of context in that situation. I mean, it might still work in Germany, I don't know, but it would be a very different thing to do than, maybe in Mexico. Which would make the story just seem a bit weird if you just pretended that was normal.
Yes, all these kind of things is the ones we need to justify, because and to represent, so the system can manage them properly. Because in one way, it can be very interesting not to have a guy in the UK or in Germany singing a serenade, but it wouldn't make sense to expect the same answer, for example, from the girl from that in Mexico. No, it wouldn't make sense. Yeah. And the system needs to understand that. So let me just tell you quickly a story. When I arrived to England, I met this Norwegian girl, and I was telling her about serenades, and she told me, if someone serenaded to me, I will start to laughing and laughing. No? Yeah. Like, what is this? So maybe a system could have a Mexican playing a serenade in Norway, and then the logical answer will be that the girl start to laugh, and to make fun of the guy because it's something completely strange. No, that could be something novel, yes, but you need to have all that social context, that knowledge about the culture. So that's the kind of stuff we still need to represent properly in these kind of systems, and definitely system-based love of data, just linguistic data, cannot represent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like one question in general is whether a computer can ever write, a story that people would actually find meaningful. And I think one criticism, or like one reason that people say why this is not possible, is because you have to have this experience of actually existing in the world and knowing all the small details that you can only really get to by living in the country, or not the country, but like in the world and experiencing these things. And yeah, I mean, is this like a fundamental barrier that is going to prevent computers from ever being able to actually write convincing stories? Or is it maybe not that important if the stories, I don't know, I mean, there's lots and lots of previous stories that they can maybe use to figure out what makes a good story. Yeah, I don't know. Is that a fundamental barrier? I don't know. Or can that be circumvented somehow?
It's just, I think there are a lot of things related to this question. In one hand, I just mentioned that I provide information to Mexica. I provide the stories. Mexica use that stories not to get words, but to get information about the world. And from that information generates new stories that different to the ones I used to feed the system. Can those stories be meaningful to someone? I will say maybe, no, maybe yes. It depends also in the other person. It depends on the expectation of the other person. It depends on a lot of things. Yes. So in that sense, I don't think that necessarily can be a barrier. No? GPT-3 can also produce something that makes you reflect, make you think, make you see in different ways. Something. No? The system doesn't have an idea that it is producing that on you, but it can happen as well, no? But of course, we humans, the way we write and what we transmit to the readers is very different. I mean, computers don't have any opportunity at the moment to have this kind of experience, no, the rich experiences we have when we communicate, no. But maybe in the future we will be able to have systems with much more rich experience with all this cultural and social knowledge. I don't see that necessarily is a limit, you know. At the moment it is, but I think in the future can be incorporated, no, if we find the right way to do it. So that's the reason I said that this question has like different perspectives, different vertices. Another thing, and I want to mention about your question, is that in the book, and this is Mike's idea, Mike was reflecting what happened if the computer tell us stories about its experience in the internet, for example.
Yeah.
Computers, no? All the ways that happen. What will happen there? No? The computer will be having experience, and it's going to be completely different to what we have lived. I think it's an interesting idea to think about. No, sometimes people ask me if I want Mexica to write to a human, and no, not really. What I would like is that Mexica could produce its own style, and that some people feel attracted to that style. But I'm not pretending to produce outputs that people think it's produced by a human. That's not my goal. Yes. That's another perspective also, no, that some of us are not interested to produce this reproduction of humans. How are we going to reproduce a human nowadays? We don't have any way, but we can produce systems that generate interesting things, everybody knowing that that's a computer generated output and it has a specific characteristics that belong to computers. No?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I was curious about is almost kind of where in the future the development of these new systems can come from. Because, I mean, so from the way it seemed to me from the book is that often these projects are one person or very small teams kind of working on something on their own or in very small groups and then producing these systems. And this is, of course, quite different. I mean, this is, most of that's, in the past, in the 70s, 80s, whatever, right? That's, of course, quite different from, big teams like DeepMind or OpenAI or whatever, who have lots and lots of people working together to have, just very fast advance, right? Because you have so many more people. And I don't know. So I have like one, basically I'm wondering whether there are big companies, especially Amazon or Apple, that might be trying to develop something like this. And I'm just curious kind of whether you think this is the case or not. So, I mean, for example, for Amazon, the reason why I think for them it would be very interesting to do this is because if you think what they are as a company, they display books, right? Because when you search, you get all kinds of different things. They distribute the books to the people. If you use Kindle, they actually, show you the book on itself. And they have the ratings from people doing that, so they have the feedback. The only thing they kind of don't have is the creation of books itself. But basically, if they manage to do creation also, they'd have like the entire cycle of fiction, right? From producing it to bringing it to the people selling it, getting feedback on it, also on Kindle, like what people highlight, how long they stay on a page, what the rating is at the end, all these kind of things. And it just seemed to me like it would almost be crazy if Amazon didn't spend a few million euros or dollars a year to just like throw together a few computer scientists, linguists, writers to produce a system like that. Because if they achieve it, the payoff would probably be enormous, because they could, sell large parts of the entire fiction writing system without having to pay copyright to authors and all that kind of stuff. I'm just curious, like, does that, anything like that kind of, do you know of anything like that? Or is what I'm saying a bit silly?
No, I don't think it's silly at all. As you said, and you are completely right, most of these systems have been developed by very, very small groups or individuals, no? Many of the systems are PhD dissertation, no? Minstrel, Daydreamer, and others are PhD dissertations, because in general this is basic research, and they don't have so far a clear commercial application. The reason all these companies you mentioned are invested so much now in deep neural networks is because they see a commercial application. As you mentioned, they see money there, no? Companies, the purpose of companies to generate money, no? And so when that happens, then of course they are very interested, and they have this army of scientists and engineers working in all these developments. And I think what you described is one of the goals of developing programs like GPT, no, Chat GPT or GPT-3, and soon we will have GPT-4. That's the direction they are aiming, no? Because you describe it very well. They will have the control of the whole creative process in writing, and that means a lot of money. So yes, they are. I believe that's one of their main goals, which is not a scientific goal. So the companies, as long as they see that they can get some profits, will invest a lot in that technologies. And ideas like the ones I work with don't have that kind of support, of course, not because, as I said, they are not have any evident commercial application. But that's the reason, no, some of us work in universities. That's the place where we can develop this kind of stuff. Now that maybe someday they will have some other kind of commercial application. But for me, the important thing is to try to contribute to the understanding of how we work. So, but you are completely right. I think your description is very precise.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I always wondered just whether that was like, a crazy idea I had or something sensible. But it's interesting. I never thought about it. I never thought about it that the old ones were not, that the emphasis is, between academic basic work and commercial applications. I never quite drew that distinction so clearly, but that's of course a huge reason why, why these differences exist. Yeah.
And you describe one scenario, but there is other scenario. For example, for video games. Video games is a huge industry producing lots and lots of money. And there are people trying to produce video games that can generate their own stories, no? Because imagine when you are playing, no, with these systems, and the system is intelligent enough to start to improvise the story based on what is happening, that based on your own characteristics and all that will produce a big thing. No? That's one of the things we mentioned in the book. So I think video games is another good example of how these technologies are trying to be used in order to produce commercial benefits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As always, the future is very difficult to predict. But what do you think is going to happen, like in the next few years? I mean, it seems to me like with ChatGPT, there's been, at least when it comes to the words a computer can put together and create coherent sentences and all that kind of stuff, there's been huge advances in the last few years. I don't know, like, what do you think is going to happen, like in the next 5 to 10 years or something, of machines trying to create fiction?
Well, I think one of the things is that it's going to be clear for the developers and for the people all the limitation this system have, which I think is important that people become aware of them. And as a result of that will happen what we just mentioned earlier in this conversation, that the next step is to start to mix the different approaches we have, no? That we know have had some achievements, but we need to combine them. And I think that's going to be the next step for the following years. I think people will walk in that direction. It's going to be enough? I don't think. As I mentioned also earlier, I think we need something different, but we need to work. I mean, to move, to experiment, and then see the new limitations and the new achievements, and then start to figure out how to improve all these ideas. That's how I see. Also, I think few people will work with the idea of trying to represent how our mind works when we are writing. And in that direction, also, I think one of the ideas is to mix this kind of system, but also to think in new theories, not new theories. That's the reason the kind of research you do, I'm very interested about, because I think I can get a lot of really interesting information from that to try to implement in the system. So the more that other areas like neuroscience and other and social sciences advance, we can also try to incorporate those ideas in computer models. So interdisciplinary work for me is also a key factor in the future, because all these systems we have been talking about basically are done for people from the computer science world. And storytelling is something so interdisciplinary. We need to really work with other disciplines, not just from our perspective as computer scientists. So I think those are the direction I see for the future, in the near future.
And for you personally, is that, I mean, are you continuing working on, yeah, I guess, what did I say earlier? Trying to model the creative process by creating a program that kind of tries to do that. Is this what you continue working on in that vein, or?
Yes, definitely. For me, MEXICA is has become in my life project, no, the project for me for the rest of my life, because there are too many things to do there, too many things. I'm still working in different aspects, improving the way MEXICA, for example, evaluates its own outputs. You know, the way, for example, I developed a model to identify when a plot is not emotional coherent. So there are a lot of ways we behave that follow certain patterns that are related to emotions, and it's very important to understand them in order to make coherent plots. So that's an example. For example, I'm also working with some artists in New York, because they are multimedia artists, and they are developing a piece called Stone of Madness that includes videos and writing and different stuff. And we want MEXICA to be part of the creative process. So we are working together. And we are modifying MEXICA so the system can adapt to their necessities, so it can produce things that can be part of their piece. So this is a really, really interesting and huge challenge, because we are now talking that the artists, Lily and Bill, that's their names, have to feel really comfortable with the outputs, that to feel that really contribute to their piece. So we are talking about real artists, famous, very, very strict artists, which are really good. And of course, they risk with this. So that's a really interesting way to put MEXICA in the real world and see what we can get from that. So there are a lot of things in the future. Let's see my energy, how long it lasts to continue with this. But yes, at least at the moment, my plans are to continue enriching this. And the reason is because I have created a really, in my opinion, interesting infrastructure with all this model, with the MEXICA. and I think we need to exploit it, no? To take the best way to see new ideas. No? So that's my goal, and I hope I'm able to achieve it and to leave it to the community so they can still continue developing these ideas.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I've run through my questions. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add at the end.
I will just say thank you so much for inviting me. It's been very interesting for me, this conversation. I hope people realize that it's very important to be informed about how this system works. I hope the book Story Machines achieve this goal, and also the new book we will publish in a few months. And
yeah, what's that going to be called? Do you know already?
Yes, Introduction to Narrative Generators.
Cool.
That's the title. And as I said, you don't need to know how to program a computer to read this coming book. And for us, that was a key aspect, because we want as much people as possible to really get informed about all this, to learn different aspects. In that book, one chapter is dedicated to deep neural networks and transformers, to try to provide a good idea how it works, and also to the other techniques, no, problem solving and MEXICA. Of course, we have a whole chapter about that. So I think with that, we as society will be in a better position to push our politicians and all these people making laws to do the right work, in order we can have or take advantage of the positive things that these technologies have, and be very careful with the risks that this technology also have. And so I hope that in some way this conversation contributes in that direction.
I hope so.